I think the fact that we were having these conversations last week, not only about fine art NFTs, but also about stamps, about meme coins, about DeFi, about ordinals, I think that reflects the plurality of this on-chain space, which I think is exciting. And it also suggests that, as ever, the Web3 space, the future of the digital economy, is more diverse than ever. And I think that is a positive phenomenon. But clearly the mass adoption of these Web3 technologies, NFTs, smart contracts, blockchain, is still probably, a year or so away from kind of total fulfillment. I have to say that, spending a lot of time with some of the builders in Web3, it feels increasingly absurd that this isn't regarded as the avant-garde by the wider world. The idea that somehow, NFTs and even AI can be dismissed out of hand by the mainstream media is increasingly absurd.
Welcome back to the Defiant Podcast. I'm your host, Vinny, and I'm here with Alex Estorick, who is the editor-in-chief of RightClickSave. He's been covering the NFT revolution and change of the digital art space since 2021, and has really been doing a great job of bringing together critical conversation about digital art and NFTs, but also following how this technology has changed so many different facets of the art world and beyond. He's also a curator with a great show, Patterns of Flow, back in September 2024. Also working on FemGen. That's 3 years in a row, right? Of just bringing together incredible art. And I think you're working on a new curation presently. Isn't that right?
Always working on something.
So yeah, Alex, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks very much for having me, Vinny. I appreciate the chance to speak with the Defiant, mainly because it seems to me that the most interesting conversations happen on those borderlines between different fields. So obviously running RightClickSave, I've had a lot of airtime in the NFT conversation, but not so much in the DeFi conversation, or more broadly. Hopefully going to dig into that a little bit today.
Absolutely. And, we spent a lot of time together last week in Lisbon. We both attended the Non-Fungible Conference, which I thought this year was really fascinating in the offerings that they had. They had more DeFi and Bitcoin layer 2s and a lot more tech offerings than I've ever seen. So I think, like you're saying, this convergence of art and NFTs and the broader crypto ecosystem is clearly something that's happening. So I'd love to start with just a little bit of a background on your career, and if you can tell us a little bit about how you became involved in the world of NFTs.
Yeah, thanks. I started editing in the mainstream contemporary art world for Flash Art and Freeze, and I've since written reviews for a variety of publications, not only RightClickSave, but when I was working at Flash Art, I started something called the Uncanny Valley, which was a sort of attempt to capture that borderline, maybe border economy in between contemporary art and developments in new media, AI, generative art, and ultimately crypto. And it was actually when we started looking at the environmental cost of crypto art that I discovered Jason Bailey, Art Gnome, since my CEO at RightClickSave. And so I've been running that for 3 years, trying to document a global community of artists working with code, but also working with proprietary software, and also a load of pioneers of computational art who've tended to be ignored by the mainstream art world. So in that spirit of trying to bridge different communities, I think, NFC Lisbon was a really good case in point, where you can have different communities side by side, learning from each other and having that kind of vibrant tension. So for me, that's a really important thing to keep going with.
Yeah, I was personally very impressed with how you had people who were talking about how to make money off of liquid staking next to people who were dancing on stage, about meme coins taking off, next to people who are talking about, generative art and the importance of, adding that into the canon of traditional art. So that was, I thought, just a fantastic convergence of ideas, and to get all these people in the same room, that's where the magic happens, right?
Yes, there's a wonderful scholar in Berlin called Max Haven who wrote a book a while back, just before the NFT explosion in 2021. The book's called Art After Money, Money After Art. he regards finance as becoming more cultural and art becoming financialized. And I think with NFC Lisbon, we saw this spectrum of different asset classes. We saw, pure DeFi, we saw meme coins, we saw stamps, we saw, what you might call fine art NFTs or digital art. So you had that spectrum. I have to say, I have a relatively rogue view that ultimately what joins a lot of these things together is the attempt to inscribe in something material, something immaterial. And I would say that, to be honest, the only real meaningful distinction between a meme coin and a work of digital art is the nature of the narrative that surrounds that cultural value, that surrounds that community. So for me, I think it was a really interesting case study of this sort of financialization of culture that I think we're living through. And also, I think, for me, evidence that there is a spectrum within that sort of maybe late capitalist state.
Yeah, I'd like to linger on this because you were kind of talking about this on one of the panels that you moderated, and I felt there was tension in the panel on reacting to this idea of finance being affected by culture. Were you surprised by that? Because I think people are willing to look at NFTs as like, okay, well, it started as art that people were like literally, sending to their friends. NFT art did not begin as an art market as we think of it today. It was just a fun place to put your art on blockchain and share it with people. And then making $10 was a huge win, right? And so obviously in 2021, 2022, we saw the financialization of art. We saw NFTs becoming something that could be used as collateral. So in the same way as traditional art. But yeah, do you see people in NFTs being like resistant or more open to the idea of finance also being impacted by culture?
I mean, I think people have very strong views about what art is and that it exists sort of separate from the gritty reality of market capitalism. I think my view is that actually that unfortunately preserves this, honestly, neoliberal certainly, but also kind of neo-colonial project, the sort of Western art canon, which, purports to this kind of almost sort of moral or elite cultural realm that I don't think is actually any longer appropriate at all. And so for me, what was wonderful about the NFT was that it unlocked the ability for digital creators from all around the world to make careers for themselves without needing to be routed through or barred from mainstream galleries. So for me, I do obviously feel that artists are uniquely positioned, especially artists who have the literacy for these emerging technologies, for code, for AI, etc., to critique these systems. As I think one of the really live issues, just to go slightly off topic for a moment, is the fact that what we're seeing is this convergence of all forms of image, painting, photography, film, into this latent space, this invisible space of a machine learning algorithm. And I think that the implications for that are significant. I think that we are seeing potentially the blurring of traditional canons, of painting and photography, etc., as examples. But I think also the role of the artist has become, at least for me, a kind of not only a canary in the coal mine, but I think an agent who is capable of making legible for a human viewer, for human eyes, a world of non-human vision that is increasingly illegible and which is increasingly folded together with these kind of militarized and politically radical, not always in a good way, structures and circuits. And so for me, being at NFC Lisbon was, I think people had very strong views about art and finance. And I personally think that, honestly, if we can accept the financialization of culture, we're probably more likely to develop a discourse that is ethically inscribed than if we deny the relation of art and money, which I think, frankly, contemporary art has tried to do for a long time, which is why you get successful artists like Jeff Koons and Andy Warhol and Damien Hirst, who sort of parody that relationship, honestly. For me, let's accept that art and money are close bedfellows, if not one and the same kind of financial instrument, and go from there. And let's have a sort of honest conversation about that relationship rather than sort of being in denial about it. And so that provokes a lot of discussion, obviously, and I think that's a good thing, honestly.
It makes me think of the late night event that you did on, what was that, Wednesday, where we had several curators in the digital art space looking at images of traditional art and guessing what the price point was. It was one of those moments where I always have this dichotomy of feeling where I'm like, I love art and then I hate art. And when I see certain pieces of art and they're literally selling for $70 million and it looks like literal trash, I don't totally get it. And I think that's exactly what you're getting at here, where it's like the idea that art is bereft of financial value is just silly. I mean, the art market is thousands of years old at this point. Like, people have been putting price on beauty since the beginning of time, I think. And so what's happening with NFTs is nothing new, really.
Well, I think that's probably right. Perhaps to sort of burrow slightly into the detail, I mean, you could argue that the art market was a product of the Middle Ages. It was a product of urbanization in Europe. It was a product of a kind of growth of a moneyed middle class, of course. I think images have been financialized since that point, for sure. Mm-hmm. The fact that there was a sort of spiritual value alongside that financial value probably can't be denied. And I would argue now that, the one consistency across time, let's call it the history of Western images, is this attempt, whether it's through an icon, whether it's through a painting, post-Kantian aesthetics, if you like, and whether it's in the age of the NFT, there is this ongoing attempt to inscribe in matter something immaterial, whether that's the Holy Spirit, in the case of an icon, whether that's the kind of culture of, or that illusion of disinterested spectatorship, that kind of cult of elitism that underlies, I think, the value of a lot of Western art, and whether that's the sort of sheer financial value of a meme coin. I think, I see one continuum, but obviously, we have different asset classes. And for me, one of the roles of the magazine has been to identify the native language of these different communities. Far be it for me to say, that's art, that's a meme coin, that's a shit coin. But clearly the community, or these communities, have strong feelings about where the borders sit. The one thing I would always say, and I come back to CryptoPunks just because I think it is the purest example of this, is when you have something that is so obviously a blue chip asset, that is both in some ways continues the history of portraiture, but it's also a collectible. It seems to be both fine art, it's generative art, but also, has this sort of collectability, has this financialization. For me, CryptoPunks, as an example, destabilizes a lot of pre-existing categories of art that we hold so dear. And for me, having an honest discussion about that spectrum of, shall we say, financialized cultural assets is fascinating. But I don't think it necessarily benefits from, trying to kind of continue this old Western canon of art. I think that's useful up to a point. But for me, honestly, the emergent space of Web3 has created something quite vibrant, quite new, that's going to be affecting us a lot more in the coming months and years. And so for me, let's accept that reality and try to come to terms with it. And let's try and document the native language of that space, not try and use old terms and apply them to these new developments. I think a lot of problems happen when you try to use old terms which are no longer really fit for purpose. And obviously, I feel that that's something we've tried to do at the magazine. Whether we've been successful or not, I can't possibly comment.
Yeah, and it makes me think a lot about, so at NFC, there was a meme coin stage. And so the entire 2 days of programming for that particular stage were dedicated to meme coins. And funny enough, last week we had the breakup between Donald Trump and Elon Musk, which then spurred additional meme coins that are specifically referencing that moment. And I'm also thinking about, at the beginning of the year, Trump launches Trump coin right before the inauguration. Melania launches Melania coin right after the inauguration. I'm noticing this trend of meme coins are actually representing specific cultural moments now. It's not like in 2023, Pepe coin kind of came out of nowhere, and Pepe just being this icon of the crypto space. There was nothing timely about when it came out, versus in 2025, we have multiple examples of meme coins being launched in direct correlation to events that are happening in the real world. And I think that gets to exactly what you're talking about of culture affecting finance, because these are tokens that do have value. And even if that value is, 0.000001 cent,
The PR Genius is a top crypto PR and growth marketing agency, helping brands globally with expert PR and strategic growth marketing. They've worked with 300 plus projects like Movement Labs and IO.net. Unlike traditional agencies, they charge only on performance. Their services include earned PR opportunities and marketing services to help boost wallet holders and organic X followers. Learn more at www.theprgenius.com.
Frederick Jameson, rest in peace, wrote about, the idea of the event in the same breath with the idea that art was following the logic of the derivative. And so I think that, we're seeing this sort of manifestation of a kind of postmodern theory emerging before our eyes, or at least crystallizing or sublimating. I think we could always obviously have a very long discussion about this. I think, one of the things I'd like to come back to is this idea, Rare Pepe Wallet, which was this kind of prototype NFT marketplace, started sort of more or less as a gift economy. And I think it's probably worth sort of stressing that there are different habits of behavior that converge on these different assets. And obviously Pepe Coin was an example, but I think it's important to stress that there is a kind of spectrum of politics across this space. It's not just a sort of tech libertarian nightmare. I think a lot of people have strong views. A lot of people sit at one point on the spectrum, but I wouldn't want to judge anyone on that spectrum. I think what felt great about NFC Lisbon, as well as this summit, this digital art summit that took place in 2022, the historic NFT Fest, was what you had was this kind of climate of toleration across this sort of really sort of divergent politics. And so for me, that's interesting. And that represents, honestly, a kind of test bed for the kind of political sphere that I would love to see. When you have people coming together from a divergent politics within that climate of toleration, I think it's the best of crypto, but it also, I think, offers a pathway forward for this kind of new decentralized sort of natively digital economy.
Yeah, that's a great point, because we're seeing all over the world this kind of polarization of politics and people's opinions on, topics large and small. But within crypto, like you're saying, like within political economies, you can see basically anybody coming to crypto, whether you're a socialist, an anarchist, a libertarian in the classical definition. There's something for everyone in crypto. And I think there's definitely this optimism for how the technology can benefit society and benefit humanity. And I think that's something that is like sorely lacking from politics at large and from just the regular kind of Web 2 economies that we're living in. And something I'd like to definitely get your take on is I went into this conference really looking for like, what is the temperature of the room here? How many people attend the conference? What's the energy there? And I kind of had a bittersweet takeaway, because while there were fewer of the artists there that I might have seen in previous years, I do feel like the attendance was more diverse. So even if there were fewer artists, there were more people who were DeFi investors or who were building games on chains like Polkadot even. And so it actually, I think, even though it felt smaller than previous years, it felt more diverse, and specifically diverse in the types of thought leaders that we had there. Because as soon as you have a bunch of, optimistic NFT artists there, it just becomes a kind of WAGMI fever dream, So what was your take on the people that you interacted with and kind of the flows of culture that you saw at the event?
Yeah, I think, and also, the nature of the conversations, the way that the panel discussions were structured, you had discussions about, the existential threat posed by AI to the artist. You had conversations about collecting. You had conversations about the ownership economy, which, one could have had 5 years ago. But those conversations felt different this time. It felt like we were coming together from a divergent set of communities. I personally feel that there seems to be this fascination with the idea that there would be one blockchain, that there would be one kind of coherent, holistic entity that will unify this space, this Web3 space. But the longer it goes on, the longer the bear market goes on, the more it feels like the future of of the digital economy is going to live in a plurality of layer ones, in a plurality of layer twos. It's going to be as diverse as the communities that live on the blockchain. And so I think what we're seeing at the moment is perhaps those infrastructures settling. You hear a lot of conversation about interoperability, but not necessarily a lot of finite solutions or kind of satisfying ones. So I think that conversation is still ongoing, but I think that the fact that it is ongoing is indicative of the range of personalities, the range of entities, the range of interests of the community, which is as diverse as the wider world, but still feels like a niche, which is a shame and a bit disappointing, but perhaps not surprising at the moment.
Yeah, so that's a great point. And it makes me think about, during the recent weeks since the Pectra update, a lot of people have become bullish on Ethereum again. And even, we had Thomas on last week from the Ethereum Foundation saying that it's likely that we'll live in a future where most other chains like Solana might just become L2s on Ethereum. And so we have this renewed energy towards the idea of Ethereum being that decentralized mega computer of the world. I mean, do you see that as being realistic, or do you think that artists will always want to have multiple chains?
I find it hard to imagine a world with one chain. I mean, that being said, there was a moment in 2021 when I think 97% of NFTs were being minted on Ethereum.
Right.
So, it has had that dominance. We published an article during the merge, which was that moment where I think the Ethereum community of engineers really showed the power of this kind of decentralized operation, showed that you could manifest infrastructural change at a systemic level. So for me, Ethereum has previous for being able to execute at scale, and to provide obviously a kind of operability that is perhaps not true of other chains. Right now,
Right.
I think it's probably fair to say that the complaints about gas fees have reached, I think, their highest point, and I think that the Ethereum community will be trying to address that pretty promptly. I think it is fair to come back to Tezos as this kind of more affordable, inclusive, horizontal alternative, which is where a lot of artists have sort of made their names, if not made their fortunes. And I think, from my perspective, it's important to still kind of sustain and support that vision of an on-chain economy, which is not a kind of another star system. That obviously we've tried to support that vision at the magazine. I don't think it helps that the minimum resale royalty of 10%, which was a kind of community-wide standard back in 2021, 2022, has since fallen away. And I think that's a great source of frustration to me, because I think this idea of a creator economy has since given way to a collector economy, perhaps, but certainly not the kind of inclusive space that I was rather hoping that 2021 would engineer in the long term.
I'm so glad you brought that up, because I remember in late 2022, that's when we were having these conversations about, OpenSea and Blur finding ways to basically sidetrack the royalties that were baked into the smart contract. And that to me was a huge shift away from what I like to call the NFT revolution, which is the idea that creators can have artwork that helps sustain them throughout their career, that they are benefiting from their increase in prestige and popularity from every single sale, not just the new pieces, but the early pieces that they probably sold at lower price points. And so one thing I was kind of disappointed to see at NFC Lisbon this year was I just haven't yet seen a solution to this. And we're talking about this happening 2.5 years ago. So where are we going if we can't have royalties baked into the contracts the same way that they were in the beginning? Have you heard of any people still working on this problem, or is this just something that artists are taking as a for granted loss?
I think artists have had to come to terms with this reality. I think a lot of artists, at least initially, went straight to Manifold. They tried to develop their own smart contracts. But I think that the majority of artists starting out on chain are still realistically going to have to rely on the smart contracts that have been dictated to them by whatever marketplace they've chosen to sell on. And if they were to code a royalty into it, I suspect that they wouldn't, those royalties wouldn't be supported by the leading, marketplaces. I do think that, if the next bull market comes along, I suspect that conversation about royalties will revive, because the whole point of the Web3 economy was that it was premised on this kind of vibrant secondary market. And I think if that doesn't exist, it defies the kind of long-term future of that whole ecosystem. I would say, and just to kind of come back to an article we published on Right Click Save earlier this year, which was titled "Whatever Happened to NFTs," which I wrote with our lead data analyst, Kyle Waters. We drew attention to particularly two Ethereum layer 2, Zora and Base, which is sort of spearheaded by Coinbase, to identify that this trend towards consumers adopting sort of the tendency to mint low-cost NFT collections. And to quote the State of Crypto report, 2024, NFT activity appears to have shifted from high volume secondary markets to low cost social collecting experiences. So I think that doesn't necessarily resolve the question about royalties, but it does suggest that collecting habits have evolved since the reality of a secondary royalty has declined, which might not be, all bad.
Get 20% APY on ETH with the High Growth Vault by Kelp in one click. Highgain uses blue-chip DeFi strategies with restaked ETH across Aave, Pendle, Usual, and Elixir, managed by strategy pros Ultra Yield and Upshift to deliver highest rewards on ETH, all in just one click. Deposit your ETH, receive Highgain ETH, and stay liquid in DeFi. Trade or use Highgain ETH on platforms like Pendle and Balancer while still stacking rewards. Follow along these steps to get started. You have Foundation launching Rodeo, right? Which is exactly what you're talking about. We have people who are basically minting works in progress. And you can think of it as if you were going to a museum show and you saw, complete paintings on one wall, but then a glass enclosure filled with the sketches that lead up to that painting. So those sketches are the things that are now being minted on Rodeo. And so, it's a completely different way of thinking about value, where it's not just about having value in the final product, but having value in all of the little pieces and stages that lead up to that. So there's definitely a shift happening in what people are minting and what they're collecting. I think that's really interesting because you kind of have to shift. If there are no royalties in the conversation anymore, there has to be something that changes. And we also had the emergence of open editions happening a lot more frequently post X royalties than before. So I definitely think people are adjusting, but I find it interesting, again, that this fight seems to have kind of gone to the wayside, and it's more, and maybe this is what artists do. They look for alternate solutions rather than fighting what maybe they see as a losing battle.
I think also we have to perhaps acknowledge that when we use words like artist or collector or curator, maybe in actual reality, these are one person, or that we are talking about a spectrum of kind of creative entrepreneurs. Because as everybody will remember that, the early NFT marketplaces were really gift economies, spaces where artists could share work, but also collect work by their peers. I think we are talking about a generation of hybrids. And of course, one might be more on the creator side than a collector side, or vice versa. But I think maybe drawing kind of finite distinctions between these different actors is maybe no longer appropriate. I'm reassured that, you get platforms like 01 continuing to kind of shape that kind of vision, or follow that vision of a creator economy where, you are invited to create in order to collect. And I think that kind of that notion of a creator economy or a space for co-creation between artists and collectors is vibrant and is perhaps indicative of where this sort of financialized art market is ultimately going to go. I think we are all creators if we want to be. Indeed, as they always say, creativity is the new productivity after generative AI. And so if we believe that, then I think, the reality is there's going to be a premium placed on the creative power of the individual going forward. And so I think artists will no longer have quite the same responsibility to produce, to sweat over the actual production process. And I think that over time, particularly with digital art, certainly with code-based practices, we're going to see a premium placed on the concept, on the idea that goes into perhaps, prompting a mixture of images and texts and videos and so on. And so for me, I think it sounds strange perhaps to move from a conversation about royalties to a conversation about generative AI. But I think that the tectonics have so shifted in the way we make, create, and collect in recent years that I think royalties will likely come back, because we're talking about, also a digital economy that needs to compensate cultural laborers who are having their IP scraped from under their nose. And so I see a lot of changes taking place, and I think ultimately it's too early to tell what kind of cultural economy we're ultimately going to end up with. But I suspect this idea of the old idea of a separation between creators, collectors, and curators, etc., will probably break down, and that could be a good thing, because I think we'll see something fundamentally different and hopefully inclusive and not exclusive, which is certainly how it feels sometimes like the sort of things are trending.
And it makes me think too, the porous nature of whether or not you're a collector, creator, curator, writer of your work. It also goes to the fact that we did have so many different kinds of people at this conference. And something I was thinking about is, a lot of NFT holders, like they're looking for different venues for making money off of their creative capital, but also making money off of their crypto. And I wonder how many people were paying attention to the DeFi panels. I think that NFT artists are actually a really great community for trying out new technologies. Something I'm thinking about is I just did a product review for Baratown, which is a consumer app to work on Barachain. And you can do like swaps between different, types of coins. You can use your ETH as collateral or your Bitcoin as collateral. And what's so interesting about it is it's literally like a dashboard interface with a little bear on a bicycle biking around your portfolio manager and biking around DApp experience. And so this, to me, it goes back to what you said at the beginning, the way in which finance is becoming more and more artistic. Like the whole idea of this thing is to be as creative as possible and to make everything very visual when you're talking about financial tools that can be very difficult to understand if you're just reading a white paper about it. And so when I'm thinking about all the artists who are walking through NFC Lisbon, this is the type of consumer app that they could understand, and it's the type of thing that I think could potentially give them new venues for investing. A lot of people I talked to last week, they have all of this money, all of this crypto left over from the bull run. And what they're essentially doing is they're holding it in their wallets and then they're cashing out in order to pay their rent. They're cashing out to buy their flight to the next conference, right? And so they're not really taking advantage of that crypto that they've accrued over the last few years through sales. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but artists are not necessarily always the most financially competent types of people, right? And so I think
not
there's
only
this
artists.
kind of not only artists, exactly. And so I wonder, I've been really curious about all these DeFi panels that we saw at NFC and like what was the idea behind it? Do you think NFT artists are the kind of potential consumer that could actually tap into DeFi? I mean, think about it. They already have wallets. They already believe in crypto. They already fund their lives through crypto. It's a very different kind of potential customer versus a normie who maybe thinks that crypto is like a total scam or NFTs are dead or, insert mainstream media propaganda here, right?
Yes, I think it's hard not to feel that both NFTs, crypto, and everything else have been kind of discredited in the mainstream media. But certainly I think people understand digital art as maybe a gateway drug to crypto. The simple reality is if you want to operate in that Web3 ecosystem using that infrastructure, you need a level of literacy still, which I think is a barrier. But I think that, if you spend time in the digital art space, you're going to become more inclined to having a wallet and more comfortable with making sort of peer-to-peer payments and so on, and using a different set of infrastructures. Maybe it feels a little bit DIY still at the moment, and maybe with the progress of stable coins, that will become more normalized and a bit more user-friendly. But certainly, I think NFC Lisbon was evidence that if you collect digital art on the blockchain, chances are you are adjacent to DeFi. You are going to be interested in meme coins, even if you don't want to buy one. So for me, or invest in that space or that community or that law, I think for me, we are inhabiting the same space. We're sharing the same set of infrastructures. But I think people are still comfortable with only perhaps one narrow corner of it. And so what was kind of refreshing about that conference was the feeling that ultimately we're going to have to come to terms with all these different alternatives. And because to me, it felt like a kind of test bed for the future of the cultural economy and maybe the future of the more decentralized global economy.
Goat Network is the first sustainable BTC yield chain powered by decentralized sequencers using multi-coin POS. Goat's mission is to transform BTC and Doge from passive holdings into active, yield-generating assets through a one-of-a-kind economic model that tokenizes sequencer revenues, unlocking the full potential of BTC-Fi and meme-Fi in a way that's never been done before, and creating new yield opportunities for Bitcoin and Dogecoin holders. Supply BTC or Doge, earn BTC in perpetuity. Get started through our user rewards onboarding portal, onepiece.goat.network. We keep on touching upon these ideas of like creating content and creating culture and finding ways to find financial value in it. And one thing that I'm thinking, in addition to obviously NFTs and all kinds of content that you could tokenize, is there are different protocols that are right now trying to tokenize our personal data. And so the example being, in Web 2, we have all of these different data points that are collected about us that let Facebook or Google or Amazon know the types of things that we like to buy, the types of things that we like to engage in, the things we like, the things we hate, the things that get an emotional response out of us. And naturally, this data is extremely important. It is cultural data too, right? Because it's not just about the information that's being taken from me, it's the information about my demographic, putting it together with data points about other people who are like me. And so it's all that information that's extremely, extremely valuable, and yet which individuals don't get to monetize in the same way that these companies get to. And so that's something we've been talking about in the NFT world, I think since you and I both got into it, which is the idea that the content creator would be the one who owns their content, who owns their data and all of that. And so when you're mentioning culture being kind of tokenized, like, are you also thinking about our data and our information and how that feeds into different AI algorithms? Or are you thinking mostly on like the things that we create?
Yeah, I think it's probably no longer feasible to separate the creator or cultural economy from machine learning. I think the mass adoption of generative AI has probably normalized that kind of digital economy or creator economy. We did an article recently with Krista Kim called "Can We Prove We Are Human in a World of Machines?" And that was really a kind of an attempt to sort of set out a pathway towards sort of more decentralized AI, smaller AI models that might be controlled by their users, for example. Because I think one of the things people are resistant to with the large sort of centralized tech monopolies having control over these large language models is the idea that they've seeded their data irreversibly. I think it's probably fair to say, and this is something that we set out in the article, that this combination of sort of data literacy, simulation literacies, decentralized AI, and in this case, proof of personhood, means that we are heading towards a moment where I think at a time when national governments are really going to lengths to sever the relationship between the human bodies of their own citizens and those citizens' data bodies, I think actually what a lot of people are going to be looking for is a way of maintaining ownership or control over their own data body. And I think something about this combination of decentralized AI and proof of personhood, means that hopefully we can restore human agency at a moment when I think national governments are threatening their own citizens' digital sovereignty. So for me, sorry to sort of pivot away from your question directly, but I think the answer is decentralized AI is still at a very early stage. But I do sense that we're a lot of people are a bit fed up of obviously big data and actually looking much more towards smaller models. And I think the rise of agentic AI is evidence of the sort of the value of these smaller models. But the question is, can we have a situation where human individuals take ownership not only of their own data, but of their own models and their own sort of knowledges, as we distribute them throughout these, proprietary generators?
That kind of makes me think about, for many years now, we have been faced with the "are you human?" CAPTCHA thing whenever we're interacting with certain things on the internet. And that, of course, has turned out to be something that was training AI, so that it can help them understand what a truck is, what a stoplight is, right? So I think it's interesting that we've had that as the basis of a sort of proving yourself as a human for many years. And now we're going into a kind of more dystopian view of it, where bots are super sophisticated and in some cases can pass the Turing test. We've had several AI art creators pass the Turing test in recent years, which I think is fascinating. But it's kind of cool, Krista Kim, an artist, is having this conversation at the same time that we have, zero knowledge on the other side of that, trying to figure out how can we prove that you are a person without necessarily doxing all of your data. And so, I kind of think crypto and AI are going to become more and more important as time goes on. I actually think crypto is going to be the thing that is needed to push back to this growth in AI, where, as you mentioned, there are these top companies that are creating this technology and the public has no ownership of it. These are not publicly traded companies, right? So none of us can buy stock in it. None of us can really buy anything that gives us a say in not only how it's created, but also making money, taking profits from what is clearly going to be something that is very profitable in the next 5 to 10 years. And so, yeah, it's interesting to see how crypto, I think, might actually become more important in the coming years because AI is growing at such a rate that there are no guardrails. There hasn't really been a lot of regulation that's been meaningful in helping companies determine how they're going to create these models. Sometimes I feel kind of weird about now OpenAI has read all of my articles and all of yours, and that's added to the knowledge base now, So it's it's eerie. It's definitely eerie. And will we see ourselves in an AI model one day and have to ask ourselves which one is the real one?
It's certainly, it's hard not to feel that in a multipolar world that we're not heading towards a more decentralized techno-social infrastructure. And I think if that is the case, AI will have to follow. And I think crypto would be the way for AI to bind itself to that more decentralized, user-friendly approach. And I think it's a contested debate, isn't it, between this sort of idea of these large language models overseen by multinational hegemonic entities, almost supranational bodies. At the same time, that it's hard not to feel that the global population at large is not going to become increasingly dependent on decentralized digital, probably on-chain infrastructure. So I think that feels like a conflict waiting to happen. And I suspect that it would ultimately depend on which jurisdiction one is in. Maybe the situation in Europe will be different, in Asia will be different, in America and the US. And so I don't think we're going to see a kind of global harmonious transition. As ever, I think it's going to be contested, but I do hope that we can take back control over our own, not only our own data and therefore our own data bodies, but also the bodies of knowledge that we, as you say, have had taken from us or have given willfully.
Yeah, ironically, in a way, being able to tokenize information, whether it be through articles or PDFs or whatever the text may be, might be more and more important as time goes on. We are seeing here in the US entire pages from government websites being wiped, entire pieces of information being lost. And yes, we have the Internet Archive engine that does keep track of these things, but I think it does continue to muddy the waters. And so in a world where literally 70% of nations are leaning towards right-wing authoritarianism, like crypto might actually be the thing that saves the day, which I find really interesting, that like on one hand we can have these like stupid meme coins and these ridiculous conversations on one hand, and then also at the end of the day have a technology that really can be used to safeguard humanity in a kind of interesting way.
For sure. I mean, I think, if Web 2 represents the kind of datafication of life, I think it's probably fair to say that Web3 represents the tokenization of that data and that world of data bodies. And the question is how that tokenized data is going to be stored, used, abused, because I suspect that, again, depending on the jurisdiction, a lot will change, a lot will hinge on that. And so, yeah, it's hard to see how that's going to shake out at the moment. But yeah, it's hard not to feel that machine learning, large language models, AI, maybe AGI, and crypto and tokenization don't form some kind of maybe unholy alliance or synthesis over time.
Yeah, it's like we're in a Big Bang moment, I feel.
It's hard not to
and we'll see
feel
what happens.
we're looking at a kind of tabula rasa. And I think, I don't want to use the language of the dark ages, but certainly as you see, because I think that was always premised on a kind of hierarchical, Western-centric, Eurocentric ideology. But I think it is fair to say at a very, factual level, we are seeing the dissolution of knowledge into an invisible space. And I think it's, thank goodness we have artists with the literacy to grapple with these latent spaces, these invisible spaces. I remember, I'm sitting on an interview with the artist Mario Klingerman at the moment. And what's interesting about him, I think, is that he was working with GANs to develop very lifelike faces and lifelike bodies, up to a point in 2018 when, public generators ultimately could just do it better. And what struck me as interesting about that date, that year 2018, was that was clearly the moment where latent space became public space. When even Mario Klingerman, who could make his own models if he wanted to, started to use these publicly available models instead. And so I think we may look back in history at 2018 as sort of at a moment where information passed into an invisible non-human domain at a kind of systemic level. And I think from that point on, we're having to still reckon with the implications. And so, yeah, it's because, of course, that non-human domain of images is also, of course, the space of surveillance, of capture, of drone operations, etc. And so, this idea that art can exist separately from those systems and circuits of operational images is, I think, fanciful. And so for me, I don't necessarily want to preserve this idea of art as separate from life. I'd like to think that artists, and in the broadest sense, can give the wider public these simulation literacies, these critical frameworks with which to come to terms with that which they can't see. And so for me, that is it really honestly revives the role of the artist in the 21st century in a way that I wasn't expecting. And so I think there's a lot of fear about the march of superintelligence, but I feel that digital artists and anyone with a critical understanding of these generative models and systems is not only in a privileged position, but also has a position of responsibility to onboard their peers, to make legible that which is becoming increasingly illegible.
Yeah, well said. And to wrap up, I think we've talked about a lot of things, and you've been covering this space for many years now. Do you feel after these years covering the space, after going to NFC Lisbon, more optimistic or more wary about where NFTs are headed in the near future?
I think my silence is probably telling. I think it's become more complex, honestly. I think the fact that we were having these conversations last week, not only about fine art NFTs, but also about stamps, about meme coins, about DeFi, about ordinals. I think that reflects the plurality of this on-chain space, which I think is exciting. And it also suggests that, as ever, the Web3 space, the future of the digital economy, is more diverse than ever. And I think that is a positive phenomenon. But clearly, the mass adoption of these Web3 technologies, NFTs, smart contracts, blockchain, is still probably, a year or so away from kind of total fulfillment. I have to say that, spending a lot of time with some of the builders in Web3, it feels increasingly absurd that this isn't regarded as the avant-garde by the wider world. The idea that somehow, NFTs and even AI can be dismissed out of hand by the mainstream media is increasingly absurd. And so for me, I think we're on the cusp of the normalization, the mass adoption of the digital economy, and tokenization and generative AI, and potentially a kind of decentralized alternative to the sort of hegemonic generative AI models that we are seeing take hold. So for me, I think if NFTs were the gateway drug for many into crypto, I suspect generative AI may serve the same purpose going forward. As you say, I think AI and crypto are going to become more tightly bound together in the near future. And if we take that bet, I think it's easy to foresee the mass adoption of all of this kind of crypto infrastructure. The question of who wins out in that process, Ethereum, Solana, Bitcoin, or otherwise, I think is still an open question.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you, Alex, for joining us. Where can our audience find you and find Right Click Save?
So we're at rightclicksave.com, and we have our greatest hits in a book called The New Digital Art Community, which is available from Vetro Editions. We need greater public literacy, critical literacy for these emerging technologies, which stand to affect us whether we like it or not.
Yeah, there's no choice at this point. Definitely grab the book. It is beautifully made with such an eclectic mix of conversations about NFTs. Thanks again, Alex, for joining us, and hope to see you in person again soon.
Thanks for having me, Vinny.